Hello, today I'm going to be going over how you prepare samples for acetylysis. So first thing, you are going to need a microcentrifuge tube rack, and then your pollen samples that should be in the freezer. You're going to want to do your pollen samples in multiples of 6, so 6, 12, 18, and so on, because there are only 6 spots in the centrifuge, so that just makes most sense. So for this example, I will do 6, and you're just going to line them up in the rack, and that's the first step. So I have all my samples. So the next thing you're going to do to your samples is you're going to just arbitrarily number them. So 1 through 6 for these samples, but you can go up to 12 or 18 depending on how many you want to do. So next you're going to make a spreadsheet or use the spreadsheet that's already made, and you're going to type in your samples, whether or not pollen was visible on the Q-tip, just a yes or a no, and then you're going to put in the date that you're going to acetylize the samples. So here is all of the sample information entered into the spreadsheet. A few notes about this: make sure you double check that you've written in your sample names correctly, and also double check that you've entered them in the order that you numbered them. So like sample number 1, I know is this W12-2 green, and that's how you're going to keep track through the chemical processing which sample is which. For the next step, we're going to be removing the cotton from the cotton swab, and for this we're going to need Kim wipes, 70% ethanol, and forceps. So in this step, I am taking out the Q-tip, and then I'm going to examine it and see kind of where the pollen is. So it's a little more kind of yellow colored here, so I'm assuming most of the pollen is on this side of the swab, and then I'm just going to try to get most of the cotton from that side, just rip it off. And then you can kind of look at the swab after, make sure you're not leaving any pollen behind, and then you're going to put the cotton back into the same tube. It's important that you don't switch tubes at this step because there's probably pollen just kind of like sitting around in this specific sample tube. So we want to start the process in the original tube. You're just going to repeat this process for all the rest of the samples that you have. And I forgot to mention, but after each sample, I am spraying down my forceps and then wiping them with a fresh Kim wipe. And the purpose of this is to limit cross-contaminating your samples. So you want to wipe those down really well and use a new Kim wipe every time. So now that the cotton is off the Q-tip, these samples are ready to start the acetylysis process. They can also be stored in the freezer until you're ready to acetylize them. Personally, I like to prep an entire week's worth of samples or more at one time. Just take a day to do that, and then I like to just process the rest, or process those samples kind of day by day. I think going from the prep stage to the acetylysis stage every single time you want to do acetylysis is less efficient than just prepping a whole bunch of samples one day and then acetylyzing a whole bunch of samples the next day. So the last thing you want to prepare are microscope slides. I clean all of the slides with 70% alcohol, so I just spray them down and wipe them with Kim wipes because they are kind of quite dirty out of the boxes, and you don't want any contamination in your samples. So I clean them all. I put this little piece of tape over here so that I can label them. Sometimes I also label them beforehand if I know the names of my sample, so I just put sample name and then the date I acetylize them on the label. And prepping all of these ahead of time makes actually putting the samples on them much faster and much easier. And then a few things about your clean slides. Always wear gloves when you're touching your slides, especially your cleaned slides. and only ever grab them by their edges. And then lastly, store them in a plastic bag so that they don't get dust or anything else on them. So now that your samples are prepped, you're ready to start the actual acetylysis procedure. Before you get started, there are some safety precautions that you need to take. So you'll want to be wearing a lab coat, you'll always want to have gloves on, and you will want to wear goggles. And just a heads up, proper procedure is to put your gloves on first, and then your goggles, and then your lab coat last. This is the overview of everything you'll need to complete acetylysis. The chemicals you'll be using are glacial acetic acid, acetic anhydride, and concentrated sulfuric acid. So I have all of these in smaller containers. You never want to take chemical directly from the large bottle. You always want to take little bits of it out, and as you use it, you can wash and refill these bottles. You're also going to want a supersaturated solution of sodium bicarbonate. This is going to be used to neutralize any acid that you may spill and acid that you want to dispose of. So we have a waste beaker. Any sort of chemical waste that you produce during the process, you're going to put in here, and we'll dispose of this properly at the end. I always like to put my glacial acetic acid in a smaller beaker so it's easier to work with. Graduated cylinder for measuring volumes. I use this little plastic thing to eject my pipette tips, and then a 1000 microliter pipette. The first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to start your water bath. I always set it at the highest setting. This heat block is kind of old and kind of doesn't work well, so you have to kind of fidget with it to make sure that it's on. So you want to see this orange light on. I usually have tape going on in the back to make sure that that's happening. But you want this water to be boiling or at 100 degrees Celsius. I always just wait until it boils. I don't use a thermometer, but we do have those if you want to be sure. Another thing is you're going to be working in a fume hood throughout this entire process. I have the set up really high right now, but it's going to be more like this. So you want to keep that pretty low. You can see you have a chart over here. And yeah, you'll be doing everything in the fume hood. You don't want to be inhaling any of these chemicals. So here's what the hood looks like, all set up with all my chemicals and running. You'll see that I have my glacial acetic acid poured into this little beaker, and then the bigger bottle can be moved back out of the way. You want to keep glacial acetic acid and the other two chemicals separate, and you want to be extra careful with acetic anhydride and the concentrated sulfuric acid. I always have them pushed against the wall so that they're not in danger of being tipped over. Sulfuric acid especially can lead to some very serious acid burns, so be very cautious when you have that bottle open and you're using that chemical. I also have my samples ready to start. Make sure if you prepped your samples ahead of time, you have the date that you're acetylizing them in the spreadsheet. And the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to open all your samples, and you're going to add 1 milliliter or 1000 microliters of glacial acetic acid into each tube. Then you're going to centrifuge all of the samples at 1060 G for 3 minutes. When you're pipetting, make sure that you're never touching the tip to any one of the tubes. And if you do, just make sure you eject that tip and put on a new one before you move to the next tube. Otherwise, you're going to have cross-contamination between all your samples. So I have my samples in the centrifuge right now. And I wanted to mention one more thing. Also, try not to leave your tubes open for very long. Only open them when necessary and close them right away after. This is also going to help reduce airborne contamination. I went ahead and mixed the acetylysis mixture while my samples were in the centrifuge. And I have a little cheat sheet on how much of each chemical to use. But you're gonna measure those out in a graduated cylinder. The tube after both chemicals are in there is going to be a little hot. You might see some discoloration. That's normal. A note with the sulfuric acid, when you are pipetting that, pipette it very slowly and add it, when you're adding it, just want to reduce the chance of spilling those because that's dangerous and a big headache. Following the centrifuge step, you're going to decant all of the glacial acetic acid from all the samples into the waste beaker. Then you're going to add 900 microliters of the acetolysis mixture into each of the tubes. Then you're going to take one of these wooden stir sticks. You're going to push the cotton to the bottom of the tube, and then we're going to put it into our boiling water bath. So here are the samples in the water bath. Hopefully by the time you're doing acetolysis, we have a bigger beaker. This one's a little bit too small, as you can see. But we're going to want to let the samples sit in there for at least 10 minutes. The purpose of this is A, to dissolve the cotton, and B, to continue the chemical reaction. You're going to see a color change most likely in most of the samples, and the degree of the color change seems to be dependent on how much pollen is present. I also wanted to mention that when you're stirring the samples before the water bath, when you're stirring them with the wooden stir stick, make sure you're using a new stick for each sample, and make sure you're treating that stick as chemical waste, so it's going to go with all your pipette tips, and those are all going to be properly disposed of at the end of the procedure. So I've now removed the samples from the water bath. At this point, there should be no cotton left in the sample, and I'm going to let them sit with their caps open for about a minute, and then they're going to go back into the centrifuge for 3 minutes at 1060 G. While the samples are in the centrifuge, I went ahead and laid out all of those clean microscope slides that we made. I do 2 slides per sample, so I've laid out a total of 12 slides. One more thing I wanted to mention, so the graduated cylinder that we used for the acetolysis mixture, as soon as the mixture was out, I poured the rest, or the remaining mixture, into the waste jar. I then rinsed out the cylinder carefully with the sodium bicarbonate solution, and I also put that in the waste beaker, and then I added a little bit more sodium bicarbonate to the waste beaker just to neutralize any remaining acids. And then I set the graduated cylinder in the sink. We're gonna accumulate a few more dishes over this process, and then we'll wash them all at the end. So after the centrifuge step, you might be able to visualize the pollen. It'll look like little black dots. You can kind of see it at the bottom of the tube there. It'll probably be all collected on one side of the tube. So that's your pollen sample. And the next thing you're going to do is you're going to use a pipette to remove as much liquid as possible without disturbing those pollen grains. So I've removed all of the liquid from the samples and disposed of that in the waste beaker. And then I added 800 microliters of glacial acetic acid into each tube. And now the samples are being centrifuged at 1060 G for 3 minutes. After this, I'm going to once again remove all of the liquid from the tube, being careful not to disturb the pollen sample. And then I'm going to be adding water to each tube. I usually try to shoot for like 75% of the tube being full of water at that step. The samples now have water in them, so I'm centrifuging once again at 1060 G. After they're centrifuged, I'm going to remove the liquid carefully one last time, and then we'll move on to staining the pollen. After the water has been removed from your samples, it's now okay to work outside of the hood. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to add 1 drop of this Saffron O stain to each tube, and then you're also going to add 1 drop of the glycerin solution to each tube. Then you're going to shut the tubes, mix them gently, and then centrifuge one last time. I only do a minute for this last centrifuge. So after the pollen has been stained and you've centrifuged all your samples, you can go ahead and draw up your whole sample and then split it in between 2 slides, as I've done here. And then you're just going to add a cover slip on top of each of those. Add it carefully so that you don't get any air bubbles, or you minimize air bubbles. And then after they all have cover slips, you can go ahead and seal the slides with clear nail polish. So a few final remarks. Make sure that after you have all of your slides set up that you label them. And then over in the hood, make sure that both liquid and solid chemical waste go into the hazardous waste containers, and that all glassware is washed and so that it's ready for the next round of acetylysis.